This happened when I was around 13 years old, and it's a big part of why I'm still nervous about being alone in the dark. It's also the reason I won't go anywhere like a cellar, crawl space, or basement. Pretty much any dark, damp place. But before I get to what happened, I need to share some background. My mom remarried, let's call her husband Dave, and they decided to move my brother and me to a different state, away from our family. Before they got married, there was an incident where Dave attacked our dad with a knife, and our dad ended up shooting him. The gun had scatter shot in it instead of regular bullets, thank goodness. Anyway, they found this 2-story place in Virginia, near a state park. They told us they got a fantastic price on it because it was so isolated, way back in the woods, far from anything or anyone. At that time, my brother Eric and I hadn't seen the house yet since we were staying with our grandma and going to school until they finished moving everything in. I really didn't want to go because I wasn't fond of the guy my mom had married. But as a kid, she wasn't going to take my opinion too seriously. The day we had to leave finally came, and I was really upset since, like I said, I didn't like him. We took a 3-hour drive to the new place, and when we got there, my brother and I saw this amazing house for the first time. It was 2 stories, with the basement as the bottom level and the rest of the house on top. When our mom had told us it was away from everything, we didn't realize she meant it was in such a remote spot that we were basically out in the middle of nowhere. This house was a good 5 miles from the nearest main road and surrounded by dense woods. Here's how the house was set up, which is important to remember. The basement was the entire bottom level, with only one entrance and small windows all around it. You had to go up a wide, wooden staircase to a wraparound porch. At the top of the steps, 2 large white French doors served as the main entrance. When you walked through the front door, you'd be in the dining room. From there, you could either go straight into the kitchen or take a small step down into a hallway that led to the only bathroom, the basement door, and the back door. To the right was the living room with my mom and Dave's room off to the side. You could also pass through an archway into my room on the left, and Eric's room was on the right. The wraparound porch had windows from every room at eye level when you stood on it. My brother and I had rooms toward the back of the house, and if you looked out our windows, you'd see nothing but woods. My first experience in that house happened around a month after we moved in. Everyone else was asleep, but I was awake, playing video games and listening to music. My window had heavy blinds over it. Sometime after 1 in the morning, I started feeling tired, so I turned everything off and lay down in bed. It was quiet except for some crickets chirping outside. I was almost asleep when I heard a noise. I opened my eyes, thinking I might have imagined it, but then I heard it again. There were 3 loud thuds, like heavy boots stomping on the back porch, going back and forth. I could hardly believe it. My heart started pounding, and I was frozen with fear. Couldn't even move. Then the footsteps stopped, right in front of my window. A minute passed, and then I heard a whisper, "Christina," sounded like a man, but also not. It's hard to explain. It had this unnatural, growling quality to it. At this point, I was shaking, my blankets tossed aside. My door was open, so I could see my brother asleep in his bed across the hall. Whatever was outside started tapping on my window, and I bolted straight to my mom and Dave's room. I banged on their door, screaming for them to wake up. They came out of their room, still half asleep, asking what was wrong. I don't remember exactly what I said, but I tried to tell them that someone was at my window. Dave grabbed his flashlight and went to the back door while I stayed with my mom. He was outside for a while, and when he came back, he told us he hadn't seen anyone or found any footprints. I was beyond terrified and didn't sleep a wink that night. The next strange event didn't happen to me. It happened to my brother, who was about 7 at the time. My mom had been making him sleep alone in his room at night, but I always left my door open to help him feel safer. One night, we all went to bed as usual. My brother said he was almost asleep when he heard something near his window. It was around August, and since the house had no air conditioning, He'd cracked his window open a little to let in some air, with just a screen covering it. He heard a noise, so he sat up, thinking maybe it was just an animal. But when he looked, he saw a face with eyes glowing yellow staring at him. He screamed like he'd seen a ghost and ran straight for our mom and Dave's room, banging on their door again. Dave grabbed his flashlight and went outside to look for whoever or whatever had been at the window. But again, he came back empty-handed. After that, my brother refused to sleep in his room and started sleeping in mine. A month or two later, Eric and I came home from school to an empty house. Our mom and Dave had gone somewhere and said they'd be back later than they thought. I used my key to let us in, and my brother headed to the living room to watch TV. I took my stuff to my room and noticed that Mom hadn't finished my laundry. I decided to do it myself to help her out, so I gathered up some clothes and went down to the basement. When you opened the basement door, you had to turn on a light at the top of the stairs. The stairs were wooden and had no railing. I flipped the light switch, but nothing happened, so I could only see a little from the sunlight coming through the small windows. I made my way down the stairs carefully and turned on a light at the bottom, which thankfully worked and lit up the whole basement. I started working on the laundry without really paying attention, and then this awful smell hit me, a mix of rotting meat and smoke. It made my stomach turn. I looked around, thinking maybe an animal had fallen in through the old coal chute that ran into the house, which Dave hadn't sealed off yet. I went closer to investigate, and that was my mistake. I saw a child reaching their arms out. I was so shocked I stumbled back. The child started crawling toward me, grabbing at my pant leg. I screamed and kicked, squeezing my eyes shut, thinking that this was it. I was gonna die. Then I heard my brother call from the stairs, "Chris, you okay?" I opened my eyes and the child was gone, but there was a small handprint on my jeans. Without thinking twice, I dashed up the stairs, dragging my brother with me, and slammed the basement door shut. When our mom and Dave got home, I told them what happened, but they didn't believe me. They thought Eric and I were making it all up, acting out because we didn't want to live there. I couldn't believe my own mom didn't trust us. I was shocked and hurt. After that, I refused to go down into the basement and wouldn't let Eric go down there either. Then one day, we came home from school, and our mom said something strange had happened to her. She was cleaning the house as usual and thought she heard a child laughing. She assumed it was us and got mad, thinking we'd skip school. But when she came out of her room into the kitchen, she saw a little girl in a blue dress, holding a teddy bear. Mom was stunned. The girl raised her arm, pointed a finger at her, and said, "It's coming for you." Then she vanished. Mom was so shaken she ran out to the barn and waited there until Dave got home. She later apologized to us, admitting she was sorry for not believing us before. Not long after that, Mom and Dave divorced and we left the house for good. Dave tried many times to sell the place, but it was nearly impossible due to its past. Apparently, a family living there in the late 70s had a tragedy. The father went out of his mind, shooting the mother and one of his daughters. The other daughter hid in the basement while he set the kitchen on fire. She tried to get out, but the doors were locked, and before she could break a window, she was overcome by the smoke. She died in the fire. Dave stayed in the house until he passed a few years later, and the property was passed down to his son. Since they couldn't sell it, the house stayed in the family. I know I'll never set foot in that place again, and if anyone ever does buy it, I can only hope they don't go through what we did. This happened a long time back, almost 20 years ago when I was young. Each summer, we'd spend a week at my uncle's property, which was a huge piece of land in a remote part of Wisconsin. It felt like a paradise to us kids, and we looked forward to that week all year long. During part of the week, my parents, uncle, and cousins would do a camping trek that went through my uncle's land and into some nearby public land. When I was 12, my cousins and I were allowed to go out on our own. We'd been with our parents many times before, but going without adults was a whole new adventure. We planned a 4-day trip on the trails, longer than usual. My cousins were Jack, who was 16, Luke, who was 13, and Sarah, who was 14, making me the youngest. I was probably the most immature one, too. Jack, being the oldest, took charge. He was a natural leader, and since he stayed on his dad's property for the whole summer, he knew the place well. During the school year, he lived with his mom in the city. The first day went pretty normally. We set up camp just as the sun started to set. As darkness fell over the forest, we gathered around the fire, telling stories and roasting marshmallows. It was about 10 p.m., and we'd been sitting around the fire for about an hour when Jack heard a rustling in the bushes near our camp. We all fell quiet, trying to listen over the sound of the fire crackling. I didn't hear anything, but Sarah said she did, and Luke wasn't sure. This went on for about 5 minutes, and then a man stepped out and approached us at the fire. He introduced himself, saying he was a park ranger. He was tall, rough-looking, with a wild beard. I thought it was odd that he wasn't in uniform, but he acted friendly enough. He said he was just checking in to make sure we were safe, adding that it wasn't common to see a group of kids camping alone. We thanked him and he left. Once he was out of earshot, Jack whispered, "Did you notice he wasn't wearing a uniform?" I thought it was strange too, but wasn't sure what park rangers were supposed to wear, so I thought maybe it was okay. What really scared me, though, was the look on Jack's face. He looked worried, which made me feel the same. We tried to put the encounter behind us and continued our hike the next day, going further into the wilderness. That strange meeting with the park ranger started to fade from our thoughts, replaced by the beauty of the forest and the thrill of being on our own. You could call us naive, but we didn't think it was a big deal after we'd slept on it. After all, if he'd meant us harm, he had the chance to do it that night. The next day, Jack led us on an unfamiliar trail. We were on public land by then, and the trail was remote. We hadn't seen anyone else all day. Our parents had given us a satellite phone for emergencies, just in case we got lost or needed help. The hike wasn't difficult, just a flat trail that anyone could handle, even in regular shoes. That evening, we set up camp earlier and took our time making dinner. Once it got dark, we had a fire going again, but this time Luke and Sarah went to sleep sooner. Luke was worn out from the hike, and Sarah was tired because she'd gotten a bad sunburn. Jack and I stayed up longer, watching the fire until it was just glowing embers. I couldn't fall asleep, so I lay there awake while Jack slept next to me. Then I started to hear voices outside the tent. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, but the sounds were real. Peeking outside, I saw 2 men near the dying fire, talking in low voices. They didn't look like friendly hikers, they looked rough, and one of them reminded me of the fake ranger from before. I stayed as still as I could, afraid any movement or sound would draw their attention. I lay there, wide awake, listening to their whispered conversation and their footsteps around our camp. Eventually, it stopped, and when I peeked out again, they were gone. This was around 5 a.m., so I stayed quiet. By 6, Jack was up, so we got up together. When everyone else woke up, I told them what I'd seen. They'd all slept through it and had no idea we'd had visitors again. We were all spooked, unsure what to do until I remembered the satellite phone my uncle had given us. Jack took it from his pack and called my uncle, explaining what I'd seen. The phone speaker was loud enough for me to hear my uncle's response. He paused after Jack finished, then said, "Listen carefully. There are no park rangers in that area. Pack up and head back right now. I'll meet you as soon as I can." Deep down, I think we all had a sense that something was wrong, and Jack especially should have known. But we were young and ignored the signs. We packed up fast, skipping breakfast, and walked back quietly, each of us lost in our own thoughts about what could have happened if I hadn't been awake. A few hours later, we saw my uncle on the trail waiting for us. He led us back to his truck without saying a word. I thought he was mad at us for being careless, but that wasn't it. Years later, my uncle and I talked about that trip. He didn't say much back then because he truly didn't know what had happened. We all understood the man wasn't a real ranger, but we still don't know why he was out there or what he wanted. We know he was following us, but we'll never know if he had plans. Maybe he was just waiting for the right moment. My parents own a small cabin pretty much in the middle of nowhere. It's cozy with only 2 bedrooms and a single level. There's no TV and cell signal is spotty. We do have internet, but it's unreliable and cuts out when the weather's rough. I used to go up there with my family several times a year since I was a kid, so it always felt like a second home to me. The nearest neighbor is another cabin about a mile down the road. An elderly couple owns it, but they hardly ever use it, so we're quite isolated up there. One summer when I was around 26, my parents let me stay there for about 3 months. I was between jobs then, with an internship lined up that hadn't started yet. With nowhere else to stay, the cabin was a perfect place for me to spend that time. I'd been there for almost a month, mostly on my own. One evening at dusk, I was sitting in the living room, reading. It was another quiet night. I was alone again, as usual. Could get a little lonely out there, but I mostly enjoyed the peace. Around 10 p.m., I got up to head to the bathroom, and as I passed by the front window, I noticed someone standing on the dirt road out front. It was strange because the area was so remote. I hadn't seen another person in days, not even a passing vehicle. I went to the bathroom, and when I came out, I realized that the man hadn't moved. He just stood there, staring toward the cabin. It was unsettling, but I tried to get back to my book. Still, I couldn't shake the image of that stranger. After a while, I got up to check if he was still there. Sure enough, when I looked out, he was now standing on my porch. Getting a better look, I noticed he was covered in blood. He didn't knock or call out, just stood there silently. If he needed help, you'd think he would say something, but he didn't make a sound. At that point, I was worried. I called out to him, "Hey, everything all right?" No response, not even a blink. He just stood there, blood running down his face, looking at the door. I locked all the doors and windows, double-checking each one. Suddenly, a loud knock hit the front door. It startled me, and without much thought, I grabbed the gun we kept there for emergencies. I never imagined I'd actually need it, but I felt safer holding it. I didn't plan on using it, just hoped it would scare him off. I looked out the window and he was back on the road. I opened the door slightly and stepped onto the porch, waving at him. "Hey, do you need help? Can I call someone for you?" I asked, trying to sound calm. He looked hurt, but his behavior was odd, to say the least. I didn't know if he was a danger, but he was definitely creepy. The moment he saw me, he started running toward me. Terrified, I dashed back inside and locked the door just in time. He reached it within seconds, pounding on it with such force I thought he might break it down. I was grateful the door was solid oak, original to the old cabin, and strong. I called the police right then. They said it would take about 45 minutes to get there. I knew we were far from town, but 45 minutes felt like forever with that guy outside. I worried he might try the windows next. I stayed on the line with the dispatcher, but shortly after giving them my address, the call dropped. I was lucky to have gotten through when I did. Without service, I would have been stuck with no help on the way. Eventually, the banging stopped. I stayed by the door, barely breathing, listening. Every now and then, I'd hear his footsteps on the porch. He didn't leave. Finally, the police arrived and took him into custody, putting him in the back of a cruiser as he struggled and flailed. Once I was safe to step out, I spoke to the officers. They told me he was high on something and probably didn't even know what he was doing. They also found a crashed truck in a ditch not far from the cabin. which they thought was his. That would explain the blood. Apparently, this guy got wasted behind the wheel, crashed, then wandered out of the wreck only to scare the life out of me in the middle of nowhere. It's probably the wildest story I have, and the odds of a stranger ending up there are slim. Besides our cabin and the neighbors, there's absolutely nothing else nearby. I still don't know what he was doing on that road to begin with. I was 26 and working for a construction company when this happened. It was a smaller outfit, run by the father of a friend of mine. I'd been with the company for a few years, and part of my role was to check out potential projects and sometimes offer a rough estimate. My boss had the final say, but I would go to a site, take some photos, and then meet with him to talk over the specifics. Usually, it was straightforward work, and I was getting pretty good at it. Because of that, my boss started giving me more challenging jobs. It was a late Thursday afternoon when I headed to a new possible project. I drove down an old, neglected road. My destination was an abandoned house deep in the woods. The client wanted a quote for fixing it up, and my boss didn't know much else. Sometimes we'd go out to a site only to realize the client's requests were nearly impossible. Once, I visited a place where the client wanted to add a sunroom to a house with a foundation that was literally crumbling. We had to decline that one. As I arrived, I saw the house for the first time. It was large, with a porch that sagged like it might give way. On the porch stood an older man, leaning on a post, watching my truck as I pulled up. I parked, grabbed my clipboard and camera, and walked over. The man straightened as I approached, holding out his right hand. "How's it going, pal?" "I'm Danny," he said, his handshake almost too strong. Danny looked at least 60, maybe 5 feet 9 inches, with gray hair. He was thin but somehow had a big, round belly that nearly hung out of his shirt. I introduced myself and we got to business. Danny led me around the outside first. The house, with its peeling paint and overgrown yard, looked more abandoned than anything else. He talked about his plans, saying he'd bought the place cheaply and was ready to put in a lot of money to restore it. He seemed excited, but something about him felt off. He avoided certain questions about the house's past. For instance, when I asked him when it was built, he said he didn't know, which struck me as odd. Most people could answer that. We went inside, and the house was in worse shape than I'd expected. The floors felt unsteady under my boots, and the musty air was tough to breathe. Torn wallpaper hung in strips, and the few pieces of furniture were blanketed in dust and cobwebs. I took pictures, mentally noting how extensive the repairs would need to be. The place seemed beyond saving, a thought I kept to myself. I was ready to wrap up, feeling I'd seen enough to know this was a bigger job than we'd thought. But Danny insisted on showing me the basement. Something in his tone made me hesitate. "I don't need to see the basement, Danny. I've got enough to give you an estimate," I said. Honestly, I was sure this place was beyond saving, so I didn't see a need to check it further. But he was insistent, almost desperate. "You really should see it. It's an important part of the house," he urged. I shook my head and took a step toward the door, but Danny grabbed my arm, his grip tight and aggressive. I turned sharply, ready to defend myself. Our eyes met, and for a moment, there was a strange intensity in his gaze. Then, as quickly as it came, it disappeared, and he let go, giving me a sheepish smile as if embarrassed. Danny wasn't a large guy, and he was older. I was 26 and about 6 feet 4 inches. While I wasn't a bodybuilder, I worked with my hands and was fairly strong. I knew I could have handled him if it came to that, but luckily it didn't. I held back from making a scene and just headed for my truck. As I got in, I looked back, and there was Danny on the porch, smiling that same unsettling smile. I thought he was just embarrassed and hoped I'd let it go. On the drive back, though, the encounter lingered in my mind, giving me an uneasy feeling. It almost felt like he might have had something planned. The next day at the office, I mentioned the encounter to my boss, showing him the photos and telling him the house was practically beyond repair. As soon as he saw the pictures, he agreed. My boss then told me that Danny had sent some photos in advance, but they looked nothing like the ones I'd taken, adding to the list of strange things Danny had done. My boss suspected they weren't even of the same house. Then I told him about Danny himself and the unsettling moments we'd had alone. "That doesn't sound right," my boss said, reaching for the phone. "I'm going to call the police to check this out." I left it at that, focusing on other projects. It wasn't until a few days later that my boss called me into his office, looking serious. He told me the police had checked county records and found that the house was, in fact, abandoned and had been seized by the county years ago. There was no record of anyone named Danny owning it. That being the case, his intentions must have been bad. The house clearly wasn't up for restoration, so the only reason to bring me out there would be for some sort of trap. Maybe he let me go because he realized I was bigger and could defend myself. It makes me wonder, though, what was down in that basement. I have a half-brother named Ethan, who's nearly a decade older than me. Because of our age gap, he moved out when I was pretty young, though we stayed close while he was around. Ethan's relationship with our parents was strained, to say the least, so I was the only one in the family he really opened up to. From a young age, I remember that Ethan often got into trouble. He was suspended from school a lot, came home drunk a few times, and was involved in other things that worried my parents. When I was about 8, Ethan moved out for good. He got into the oil and gas field for a while, eventually buying a house way out in the mountains. We'd talk every week, but my parents never let me visit. I think they were concerned that he might be a bad influence on me. I thought that was ridiculous since he'd turned things around, and owning a house at 25 was quite a feat for where we were from. Ethan had always been a bit of a loner, preferring the outdoors and animals over people. That's probably why, as soon as he could afford it, he got a place out in the middle of nowhere. He said it was a small cabin with a lot of open land around it. He had a vegetable garden, a few chickens, and a lifestyle very different from the one I knew. When I graduated high school, I went to college not too far from Ethan's place, so I planned to finally visit him after my first year. Until then, we'd only seen each other once or twice a year, and I'd never been to his house. I arrived late one Friday afternoon after a 3-hour drive. Ethan greeted me warmly and showed me around his place, obviously proud of what he'd built there. His land was huge, way more than he needed. His garden was less than half an acre, and he had more than 20 acres in all. My room was in a small loft area upstairs, with a window looking out over the driveway. The house was quiet, and the closest neighbor was quite far off. That first night was uneventful. We stayed up talking late, had a few drinks on the porch, and went inside when it got cold. I went to bed around 1 a.m. sometime later. I woke up to the sound of voices outside. I looked out the small window and saw a truck parked in front of the house, its headlights flooding the ground. Ethan was outside too, arguing with a man I couldn't see clearly. Their voices were low, but the tension was clear. They were shouting at each other. The next morning, I asked Ethan about the visitor, but he brushed it off, telling me not to worry. I tried to press him for details but let it go, not wanting to spoil my visit. He left for work soon after, and I found myself alone on the property. Ethan still worked a few days a week in town, using the rest of his time on gardening and other projects. Since he owned his place and grew much of his food, he didn't need much income. By noon, I decided to explore the woods nearby. There were many trails winding through the hills, so I set out for a walk. As I was strolling through the trees, I noticed a truck driving along one of the back roads. At first, I paid it no mind. Traffic was rare here, but an occasional car or truck would pass. I couldn't stop thinking about the truck from the previous night. Then it pulled over and a man got out. He started heading towards the woods, moving quickly. I stopped for a moment, watching as he pushed through the underbrush and trees, coming directly toward me despite there being no clear trail. I turned and walked faster, but he was closing in, so I broke into a run. The man shouted for me to stop, but there was no way I'd listen. No matter how fast I went, he kept gaining, and I knew I couldn't outrun him forever. It wasn't long before he reached me, grabbing my arm and spinning me around. For a second, I stared at him as he shoved me down, nearly hitting my head on a tree. When I looked up, he had a knife in his hand. I lay there, stunned, until he ordered me to stand. I got up, and he stepped closer, saying, "Your brother owes me. Tell him he needs to pay." I tried to explain I didn't know anything, but he advanced, raising the knife. I put my hands up and assured him I'd relay the message. He gave me another shove and let me go. I hurried back to the house. When Ethan returned that evening, I confronted him, furious and shaken, but he just stood there, unaffected. My anger and fear poured out as I practically shouted at him for putting me in that position, but he still wouldn't explain. I packed my things and left that night, driving home. I didn't speak to Ethan for over a year. When I told my parents what happened, they were just as upset. I still don't know what Ethan was involved in up there, but it's clear he'd made some dangerous enemies. Even now, I worry about him. Only with time have I started to forgive him. To help you understand why my mom and I were at Whitlock Lake, I need to give you a bit of background. My mom and I have a wreath-making business in a quiet town in northern Michigan, where crime is practically unheard of. It was autumn, and the forests in Michigan were showing off their brilliant fall colors. The day was mild and vibrant. Instead of purchasing pine cones for our wreaths, we thought it would be nice to gather some ourselves from the nearby woods. I'd known about Whitlock Lake since high school, when a few friends and I would sometimes go there to hang out. It's a small campground with about 3 sites, and the lake connects to a larger one a few miles down the road. The place is tucked away in an old logging town called Jennings with a tiny population, about 20 people or so. During those high school trips, the atmosphere had always felt normal, even peaceful. But on the day my mom and I went to gather pine cones, there was something unsettling in the air, like we were being watched. We tried to brush it off, figuring it might just be some animal hiding nearby and waiting for us to go. After about an hour, we decided to move closer to where the trees meet the water. There were cute, small pine cones there, perfect for our tabletop wreaths. Not long after, we ended up near the lake's edge. Suddenly, we heard a few gunshots from across the lake. This was northern Michigan, after all, and hunting season was around the corner, so we ignored it. We got back in the car and moved farther down the trail. When we stopped, I noticed quite a few spent shotgun shells on the ground. Seeing shells isn't unusual this time of year, so we went on with our search. We reached the end of the trail, where the last 2 campsites were across from each other. We kept foraging for another 20 minutes. As we were crossing the path to the next site, we noticed something odd. A tall, 5 or 6 foot wooden pole with 2 leather straps attached, swaying in the wind. We thought it was strange. Who would put leather straps on a pole out here? But we pushed the thought aside and continued. A little later, we came across an old, dirty mattress that looked like it had been abandoned for some time. The ground around it was marshy, and stepping on it made you sink several inches. People dump trash in the woods around here sometimes, so we walked past it to get more pine cones. That's when a foul odor hit us. We both turned to each other at once, feeling suddenly uneasy, and decided it was time to leave. As we were leaving the trail, we encountered a man driving a red, old-style Cadillac. The look he gave us was unsettling, like he knew something we didn't. Maybe it was a coincidence, or maybe it was just our nerves, but my mom and I like to think we have a good instinct about things. We left as fast as we could. We haven't gone back to that lake since, and we don't plan to. About a week later, I couldn't shake what happened, so I called the police to report the incident, describing it the best I could. They said they'd check it out, but I haven't heard anything since. The memory of that day still lingers, and I often wonder what might have really been going on out there. This happened in the summer of 2003 when I was 27 and living alone in Idaho. I had always loved going on hikes, so this area was ideal for me. Being out in nature just made me feel more alive. When my friend Lena suggested we go hiking on a secluded trail, I jumped at the chance. We planned to stay overnight in a nearby cabin, which was fine by me since I enjoyed organizing trips like this. We set out early in the morning to beat the midday heat. The trail was breathtaking, winding through thick woods and rocky ground. We chatted along the way, enjoying each other's company in the quiet of nature. We didn't see anyone else for most of the morning. We knew there were others around because of footprints and an occasional cigarette butt, but the area was so vast that we never crossed paths with anyone. After a few hours, we took a break by the trail. That's when we noticed a man standing further down the path, watching us. He seemed out of place. His coat was worn and brown, and he had a tangled gray and brown beard. He didn't look like a hiker. His clothes were all wrong. It was a warm day in summer, yet he was dressed like it was a chilly fall day. I couldn't understand how he wasn't overheating. The unnerving part was that he was staring at us. Lena and I glanced at each other, and I could see she was uneasy. I felt it too. We didn't know what to do. We thought about turning back, but we had already come so far and were determined to finish our hike. So we decided to keep going, hoping he'd stay where he was and we wouldn't run into him again. But as we rounded a bend, there he was, standing right in the middle of the path. Up close, he looked even more intimidating. His eyes seemed to pierce through us. He didn't speak, just kept staring at us in this unsettling way. We tried to walk around him, but he stepped into our path. Lena and I both felt a wave of dread. We knew something was wrong. Suddenly, he lunged toward us, and we both screamed. Then he laughed, showing yellow, crooked teeth. "Calm down, ladies," he said. "I'm not going to hurt you." But we didn't trust him. We squeezed past him and took off down the trail, running until we were out of breath and couldn't hear his footsteps anymore. We continued on, hearts pounding, constantly checking over our shoulders. We didn't see him again, but we stayed on edge for the rest of the hike. That evening, we returned to the cabin where we were staying the night. With no TV and no cell phones yet, we turned on an old radio and tuned into a local station. A news report came on about a wanted man who was at large in the area. He had been targeting hikers and campers. They didn't go into detail about his crimes, but our minds filled in the blanks, and we assumed the worst. Lena and I exchanged looks, both thinking the same thing. We immediately called the police, explaining everything about the man we'd seen on the trail. We described him as best we could and gave the exact spot where we had encountered him. The police came to our cabin later, and we told them everything that happened. We didn't know if they'd find him, but we knew we had to help in any way we could. The next day, the police got back to us. They had closed the trail for now because our description matched the man they were hunting. They didn't want anyone else to go through what we had. Eventually, we heard they did catch him. He had been living rough in the park for a few weeks by then. The officers told us we were very lucky since he was likely desperate for food and money. He might have tried something more serious if we hadn't escaped when we did. We drove home as planned the next day. As frightening as the experience was, we moved on and still managed to hit the trails a few times a year. My dad had always loved going camping in the wild. He and my mom had gone on a few trips together before, but I was too young to join them back then. When I was around 10, I went with them for the first time. We were heading somewhere that could only be reached by canoe. My dad believes that real camping should be challenging. Otherwise, what's the point? Once, my mom took me and my brothers to a campground that was only slightly remote, with public bathrooms and no car access, and my dad laughed at it. He thought if you're going to do that, you might as well camp in your own backyard. We planned to stay 3 nights out in the wilderness, fishing, hiking, and just enjoying the outdoors. We spent a full day hiking and paddling before finally finding a good campsite right by the water. On the first night, we set up camp, and as the sun started setting, my parents got a fire going. After dinner, I was pretty tired, so I went to bed early, leaving my parents to relax by the fire and take in the calm surroundings. As I drifted off, the gentle sounds of the forest lulled me into a deep sleep. But by morning, things had changed. I woke to the noise of my parents hurriedly packing up our campsite and loading things into the canoe. They were already up, and I found myself alone in the tent. It was just dawn, and since we'd planned to stay for 3 nights, I felt confused. I went outside and asked why we were leaving so soon, but they just said we had to go and didn't explain. I could tell something was making them uneasy. I didn't understand what was going on, but I didn't argue. We spent the day paddling and hiking back the same way we had come. It was frustrating to leave after working so hard to get there, and I grumbled the whole way back, probably annoying my dad. Still, he wouldn't say why we had to leave, so eventually, I just let it go and forgot about it. Years later, they finally told me what happened that night. After I went to bed, a man emerged from the forest and walked up to them by the fire. As I mentioned, it was a very remote area, accessible only by canoe. There were other campsites around, but they were all by the water as far as I knew. It was strange for anyone to approach from the woods since there weren't any real trails. They described the man as older, unkempt, and looking like he'd been out there a long time. My dad also noticed he had a gun on his belt. The man politely asked my parents for food. Though he spoke calmly, the whole thing felt eerie. They didn't want to risk upsetting him, so they gave him some food and water. He thanked them and walked back into the woods. My parents stayed up all night by the fire, too afraid to sleep. They still have no idea where he came from or where he went. If he had been a camper from another site, why would he approach so late at night? He must have known how unsettling it would be. To this day, I don't know who he was, but I'm glad my parents decided to leave. Hearing about it now gives me chills. It feels like something out of a scary movie. I often wonder what would have happened if he'd had worse intentions. We were completely vulnerable out there. Neither of my parents had a weapon, so whatever he wanted to do, he could have. We would have had no way to stop him. I'm 24 now, but I was 16 when this happened. I'm about 6 feet tall and built solid. I'm not someone who gets scared easily or backs down. It was my senior year in high school, and I went to a party with my ex-girlfriend. Letting her drive was my first mistake. To cut it short, we started arguing on the way back. The party was up in the hills around my town. I'm from a city in upstate New York, near Binghamton, and those hills surround our place. In my slightly drunk state, I thought hopping out of the car would be a good way to get her off my case. I quickly realized that wasn't smart, as I was still a good 25 minutes from home. But my stubborn pride wouldn't let me call her back. By then, it was around 2:30 a.m., and I tried reaching out to friends for a ride. Hardly anyone was picking up, but eventually, I got a hold of my friend Sam. He said he'd be there soon and told me to stay on the road I was on. I put on some music and started walking. On both sides of the road, there were woods with a ditch and a 5-foot rise of trees and thick brush beyond that. The road was technically 2 lanes, but there weren't any marked lines. Then I began hearing sounds coming from the trees on my right. I turned off the music and froze, hearing something about 15 feet away in the brush. The sound stopped after a few seconds, like whoever it was hadn't realized I'd paused. After a minute, I brushed it off and kept going, right down the center of the road. Since I was a little tipsy, the usual warning alarms in my head weren't going off. I was just listening to the nighttime sounds, crickets, the wind, when I heard it again. This time, it sounded like someone was walking, not even trying to be quiet. I stopped, and the sound got louder, like they were moving toward me. I always carried a box cutter with me since my town isn't exactly the safest place. You can look it up. It has a reputation. Anyway, I took out my cutter. Then a big man stepped out from the trees. Now, I'm a well-built guy, but this man was towering over me, and he was already standing 5 feet higher because of the incline. He had on a brown jacket with a hood, and I could see he was older because of the white hair stubble on his face. His face was sharp and rugged, kind of like the actor Dolph Lundgren. Since I was a bit drunk and unsure what to do, I just said, "Man, you really startled me. How's it going?" He didn't say a word, just stood there with his hands in his pockets, staring. He gave off a bad vibe. We just looked at each other in a silent standoff that felt like it went on for ages. Finally, I said, "You okay, dude?" Still nothing. I started sidestepping to keep an eye on him, pulling out my phone to call Sam and check how close he was. The man didn't budge, only turned his body to keep watching me. By then, I was walking backward, still keeping him in sight, when Sam told me he was almost there. I looked away for a second, and the man was gone. I started hearing noises again in the woods. I told Sam to hurry up. At this point, I'd moved to the other side of the road, holding my box cutter and watching the trees. Sam pulled up, and I told him what was happening. We turned on the phone flashlights and started scanning the trees. We could hear murmurs, then a lot of snapping, like 5 or 6 people moving through the brush toward us. We exchanged a quick look and sprinted to his car. As we sped off, 3 or 4 shadows stepped out onto the road, staring at us as we drove away. To this day, I still wonder what those people were doing out there with no lights in the middle of the night. I'm just glad my ride showed up when it did and that I made it clear on the phone I was being picked up. Now, I avoid those woods for good reason.